Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this webinar, Codifying Online Safety, presented by the Australian Chapter of the International Institute of Communications. I'm Derek Wilding. I'm co-director of the Centre for Media Transition at University of Technology, Sydney, and I'm Australian Chapter President of the IIC. The IIC, as many of you will know, is an independent global forum for discussion of policy issues for converging telecommunications, media and technology industries. Its headquarters is in London and its international president is Chris Chapman, former chair of the Australian Communications and Media Authority. Before we start, I'd like to just point out that happily I'm back in the office here at UTS, so that means that I'm on the ancestral lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. So I'd like to pay respect to their elders, past and present, and also like to acknowledge them as the original custodians of knowledge for this land. As we're meeting by Zoom, I'd also like to extend that acknowledgement to the traditional owners of the lands where all of you are residing at the moment. And hopefully this may well be one of our last online events for the IIC. So regulating online content and managing online harms is a topic that is very current, very topical in a number of jurisdictions right now. Today, we're dealing with some aspects of the distinctly Australian approach to online content regulation, drawing on our well-established tradition of co-regulation, and this time overseen by our world-leading agency, the Office of the eSafety Commissioner. Most of you will have seen the really informative paper that the Office has put out on the code development process. And I must say it helped me not only to understand the actual code development aspect, but some key concepts associated with the kinds of services that are offered in this area, and also the conduct that's being regulated. So yeah, very, very helpful indeed information paper. To explore all of this, I'm delighted to welcome the Commissioner herself, Inman Grant, and a panel of industry and community representatives. I'll introduce the panel when we come to them, but first the Commissioner will give a keynote address with an opportunity for questions before we move on to the panel. So now let me introduce the Commissioner. Inman Grant has extensive experience in the private, non-profit and government sectors, including 2 decades working in senior public safety and policy roles in the tech industry at Microsoft, Twitter and Adobe. She has several international appointments in connection with her role, and she's recently been recognised both here and overseas as an influential leader in her field. Her office is as busy as it's ever been. Following the passage of the Online Safety Act in June, Julie has been leading not only the code development process we're looking at today, but the development of the closely related basic online safety expectations and some other associated instruments. So she's been keeping some of you just as busy. We'll have an opportunity for that side of things when we get to the panel, but for now, welcome, Julie.
Thank you, Derek, for that kind introduction. And my colleague Ross will be wielding the slides so that you have something to look at. And really, I hope to demystify and at least help paint a broader picture around how this all fits together. And, you know, believe it or not, it was, you know, we aren't developing the policy, we are implementing the policy. So it did take quite a bit of mental gymnastics to, you know, take some of these really complex concepts that haven't been tried out before and to, you know, put them into the paper or to develop, you know, what will be the BOE's expectation management, but I'll go through that later. So let me first start by saying it's, I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we are on today. I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and the Aboriginal elders of communities on the lands where we meet today. And so in the time I have, I'll talk about some of the unique safety reforms Australia is pioneering and how they will affect the community, how we'll use discretion, fairness and proportionality in terms of everything that we do. The strengthened internet safety laws that will take effect on the 23rd of January will provide a much stronger safety net for all Australians, and that's how all of this is designed. We're not We're not here to be the content moderators or the internet police, but serve as that safety net when things inevitably fall through the cracks. And I'm excited to explain eSafety's plan to help make that a reality. I'd also like to acknowledge my fellow panelists, many of whom have contributed to the work of my office in the last 12 months related to the Online Safety Act. And I'm looking forward to some robust discussion later this morning. But first, I think we should take a sneak peek into the recent history to show how we got here, because when we it's been such a feature in our lives. I don't know if you remember the 486, but I can confidently say that many in this audience that do personally remember the revolution sparked by personal computing as early as the 1960s, when the PC was that benign little toy that predominantly affluent nerds fooled around with in their basements and garages. And I come from Seattle, where a lot of that was happening in garages dotted around my neighborhood. Only a few visionaries deeply immersed in tech at that time could really envisage the potential that PCs might have on society today and beyond. Well, the rest of us sort of smiled politely at their future visions of network computers that could communicate with one another. But, there were many of us that just didn't get it. Nor did we really imagine where that vision would lead to or what dangers might come with that digital resolution. And I was one of those people with utopian colored glasses. It wasn't until the 1990s when PCs became more affordable and we were really able to be hooked into the copper wire phone network, the internet became a reality. And around that time, I not only worked in Congress at the intersection of social justice, policy, and technology. I was working on a range of social issues, and the congressman I was working for came in one day and said, "Hey, we've got a small little software company in our district. It's called Microsoft. Do you think you could, marry the technology issues?" And this was in 1991, so before there really was an internet. So I guess you can say I was at tech policy ground zero. But sometimes, it takes a little time for that next big thing to get recognized. But of course, these game-changing devices finally brought the internet to the masses. And by that time, the genie was out of the bottle. And so those 60s visionaries were right, and consumers flocked to the Silicon Beach with their new digital surfboards. Come on, the water's fine, but it may have been fine then, but now it is becoming a tad bit polluted, and some might even say toxic. So I think we can all agree that the internet was a different beast than it is today. And of course, social media wasn't actually a thing at that time. So the internet today is a remarkable place and has added immeasurably to global economic and social prosperity. And I think the COVID-19 pandemic has seen the internet really become an essential utility as the world turned to continue to work, learn, communicate, and be entertained. And we can have discussions about this, but I think we'll agree that hybrid work and hybrid everything will probably be the way of the future. But along with the many benefits I think we've all reaped, we also need to acknowledge the darker challenges that the internet has thrown at us. Today's internet has become a highly enabling environment for many forms of abuse. It can be an unsafe place with bullying, targeted misogyny, hatred, and racism, the unchecked spread of disinformation and misinformation, terrorist weaponization of social media, and most horrifying of all, the grooming, sexual exploitation, and abuse of children. This utopian vision of a free, unregulated internet is fast becoming less attractive, with more checks, balances, and accountability being demanded, not only by consumers and advocates, but with governments alike. And people also becoming increasingly uncomfortable with such a powerful set of gatekeepers of the internet, with more collective power and wealth than a significant bloc of nation states. In line with Derek's kind introduction, amid this growing concern, in 2015, the Australian government took a decisive first step in creating the world's first dedicated online safety agency with the sole purpose of protecting Australians from online harm. Building a citizen-focused agency like ours from ground zero hasn't been easy. And in fact, the government took portions of a whole range of other agencies, as well as other schemes like the online content scheme, created some new schemes, and we've kind of layered on different schemes a bit like an onion over the past 5 or 6 years. And I think what was really challenging as the first bespoke regulator in the space, there really was no playbook for preventing online harms. So we've had to fill in the pages as we've gone along. So next slide, please. In just 6 short years, we now believe we really have established a successful, practical, and replicable model that focuses on 3 key pillars. And these really do need to work in tandem. So it may seem strange for a regulator to say, we can't regulate our way out of online harms or arrest our way out of them. We need protection, prevention, and what I call proactive and systemic change to work together. So the first pillar, prevention, of course, involves having an in-house research function and developing best practice resources and programs to prevent online harms from happening in the first place, and arming our citizens with the tools, strategies, and advice they need to be empowered to protect themselves or their families online. And of course, our research arm is critical to building the right resources, looking at data analysis, also evaluating programs over time to make sure that the pedagogies and the resources and programs are working. Now, the second pillar is protection, and this, of course, covers the work of our investigative divisions who operate many of our world first regulatory schemes. Through these schemes, we're able to provide Australians with direct support through the application of a range of civil powers, not only to compel takedown of illegal or harmful content, whether it's child sexual abuse material, pro-terrorist content, or image-based abuse, the non-consensual sharing of intimate images and videos, but also the serious cyberbullying of an Australian child. Now, this third pillar, proactive and systemic change, really involves leveling playing field by encouraging tech firms and platforms to take greater responsibility for user safety, putting in the protections up front, so baking them in rather than bolting them on, particularly after the damage has been done. And now this is really about long-term cultural change and changing the ethos of the way that companies move fast and break things to one that's a little bit more mindful, that still encourages innovation, but also investment in safety and the user and all sort of user-centric processes through our Safety by Design initiative. To achieve this change, we spent the past 3 years working with a range of technology companies, from the enterprise level to mid-tiers to startups, the VC community, around how they fundamentally design, develop, and deploy their products with safety at the core. So we seek to surface up best practice. We develop some interactive tools that have been downloaded by companies in 32 countries. And we're also trying to stay a step ahead with our tech trends and challenges. We know that technology is always going to outpace policy. But as we see deep fakes or immersive technologies, the metaverse, decentralization, anonymity, end-to-end encryption, taking a 360-degree look at all of these issues, seeing what the positive use cases are, but what are the risks and how can our citizens mitigate the risk? And this also helps us feedback to the government, but also our department, the trends and fears that we're having, so that we make sure that any of the policy settings do accommodate these changing paradigm shifts and technologies, particularly how they might be misused or weaponized. So, there's no question that COVID-19 has impacted all of our lives in really profound ways. And this has been particularly true for agencies like ours. When you have floods of people taking to the internet, thanks to the pandemic, and lots of fear, certainty, and doubt amongst it, you won't be surprised that we saw a lot of nasty things happening. In fact, I don't think I've seen the kind of polarization on the internet as I have over the past couple of years. I'm sure a number of you have witnessed the same things. In 2020, we saw a 90% spike in reports of illegal and harmful content from 2019, including a surge from 11,000 reports to 21,000 reports, which is larger than in the online content scheme's 20-year history. Over the same period, we saw a 114% increase in reports of image-based abuse. At one point, we saw a 600% spike in reports over the Easter long weekend. There was a variant of about four different variants of sexual extortion scams that hit the net. So I guess the COVID silver lining there is that people actually knew enough to report it as a sexual extortion scam. And we put out a number of advisories around that, not to pay ever. But, a lot of people, these are designed to cause panic in people. And sometimes they hit the mark. They need a very low strike rate, and it still becomes very lucrative for them. So, we actually saw that child cyberbullying grew about 30% increase, and then our adult cyber abuse scheme, which is actually informal. It's not yet formal. Grew by almost 40%. So this is consistent. Well, there aren't any other government agencies that have similar schemes to this. The research around the world from law enforcement agencies and other hotlines showed similar trajectories in terms of increase in time online and increased incidences of abuse. Next slide, please. So I thought I'd now turn to the new powers we'll have from January to significantly boost protections for all Australians. So the Act will enhance our cyberbullying scheme to enable us to provide protection to children being bullied in all online environments. Of course, in 2015, the law was developed. The focus was social media, but we know that bullying or griefing takes place on online gaming platforms and on dating sites, and that there are all parts of the ecosystem that have a role, whether you're the search engine or you're the app store, if you're hosting rogue apps, which were developed for the purpose of targeting or humiliating people, then there is a role for all players in the ecosystem here. But the most significant change will be the new world first adult cyber abuse scheme, which I'll explain in a future slide. And this is where this will enable eSafety to require the removal of serious adult cyber abuse material that targets an Australian individual where the material is likely intended to cause serious harm. And there's a two-pronged objective test. We have to prove intent to seriously harm, but also that it's menacing, harassing, or offensive in all cases to a reasonable ordinary persons. That's a pretty high bar. And it's at a high bar because adults are considered to be more resilient than children, and we want to balance freedom of expression and freedom of opinion with that really seriously targeted content that veers into the lane of serious online harm and is really designed to silence voices, so undermine freedom of expression. So again, it's a bold new experiment. Whenever anyone comes to us experiencing serious online abuse, even if we're not able to take down the content or utilize the powers, we genuinely try and provide what I call compassionate citizen service and make sure that they at least have tools and strategies to keep themselves safer online. And sometimes we will refer them to mental health services, to legal services, or if they need it, and also refer to law enforcement where it reaches a criminal threshold or physical safety is at risk. And that's a pretty small margin. Only about 4% of our reports are referred on to law enforcement. I'll move on to our regulatory priorities. I can understand how there may be some uncertainty from both sides of the digital fence about how, when, and where these laws will be administered. So building on and drawing from our experience over the past 6 years, we'll continue, as we've always done, by applying a harms-based lens and taking an outcomes-based approach to everything we do. We'll also continue providing compassionate citizen service, as I mentioned, to those in need of assistance and scale up as we scale up our 4 regulatory schemes. The new powers and the underlying regulatory regime underpinning them gives us a modern, effective set of graduated tools to address online harms. For those of you that saw IIC, I laid out our regulatory posture and priorities. Those are on our website as well. We've already put out detailed regulatory guidance on the cyberbullying scheme as well as the image-based abuse scheme. We'll be rolling out more comprehensive regulatory guidance on the other schemes as we go. But this is the best we could do to try and explain in a single slide what this pyramid of 4 layers looks like, and how all of these pieces of very novel legislation or voluntary initiatives fit together. At the ground level is the voluntary guidance under Safety by Design, which we're encouraging all levels of industry to engage with. And we did engage with about 180 different organizations through this. The first part of the consultation was 9 months. The second part, to develop the assessment tools, was another 18 months. So this consultation was critical, and that also allowed us to surface up best practice. The next layer up is the mandatory industry codes, which will place more of an onus on industry to be proactive in the detection and removal of harmful and illegal content, what we call Class 1 content, while also putting a greater responsibility on industry to shield children from harmful content like pornography, and particularly the more violent and extreme forms, which just are not emotionally or developmentally ready for, but are, you can just, do a Google search on your smartphone and you can find it almost anywhere. But a child today can't walk into an adult store and buy a video. So the whole idea is about bringing the laws of the online world in line, acknowledging that they're different places, but in line with the real world for protective reasons. The third layer up is the basic online safety expectations. And now this is an instrument set by the minister, requiring providers to take reasonable steps to ensure their online services are safer for end users. And I'll show you a little bit more about how those work. But at the apex of the pyramid is, again, the 4 citizen-facing regulatory schemes. And where appropriate, we'll continue our collaborative approach with industry through the operation of our regulatory schemes. The informal path is often the best one. My primary goal is keeping our citizens safer online. And so, for instance, 90% of the serious cyberbullying cases that come into our office are adjudicated and are dealt with through direct engagement with the platforms, who don't want that content on their platforms either. These are often reports that have gone to the platforms in the first instance and have fallen through the cracks because they've missed context, or they've missed culture, or the volume, a range of reasons. But that's, again, where we come in as a safety net and advocate on behalf of our citizens when we think content is going to be harmful to them. Next slide, please. So I think I covered off on the serious adult cyber abuse scheme. Again, this is intentionally high, on par with the criminal provisions of 474.17. But we will have some pretty strong powers to both to require removal by perpetrators or content hosts. And if that removal isn't done when it's seen to reach that threshold, there'll be fines of up to $111,000 to perpetrators or individuals, and up to $500,000 for hosting sites and platforms. Of course, that's just a drop in the bucket for many of the larger organizations. That's for each instance. Again, if this does work like the serious cyberbullying directed at a child, hopefully we can adjudicate these earlier, particularly with the more responsible platforms, and won't have to move to the removal notice. Next slide, please. As mentioned earlier, the Online Safety Act also requires the industry to develop new codes to address issues like the proactive detection or removal of illegal content, both Class 1 and Class 2 content. These codes will be mandatory, and what we're trying to do here is really create a modern, fit-for-purpose online safety ecosystem where eSafety and the online and technology industry play a critical co-regulatory role. in terms of protecting Australians from illegal and harmful content. There are some real practical challenges here in that there are a range of what are called sectors that have been identified, 8, I believe, and there aren't necessarily, there certainly isn't any one, but there isn't even multiple trade associations that cover off on all these industries. So we appreciate that there's a tremendous amount of work going on with industry and by industry to get the right players together. We started working with the industry since July, I think a couple days after the Senate passed the legislation, to help them prepare for the codes. And as I've said before, their success is our success. So we spent several months speaking with them, but also trying to really work through and provide an outcomes-based paper around what our expectations were. Now, the industry has until July of 2022 to file these, or for us to register them. So, you know, in the grand scheme of things, when you've got a lot of stakeholders to engage with and a lot of consideration, it's a tight time frame. But we're very confident that we've got people in leadership on the industry side that are thinking long and hard about it and are really actioning this in an effective way. In terms of what we call the BOWs, the basic online safety expectations, I think there's a lot of misinformation about what they are and what they do, but they're really designed to ensure that the platforms, broadly speaking, are building these safety protections in as a license to operate and are applying and upholding their own policies and those established through the acts. So there are elements, of course, that we're trying to compare around both transparency and accountability. Next slide, please. The expectations will be determined by the minister as a legislative instrument, and public consultation on the draft determination recently closed. So feedback is currently being assessed and incorporated before a final determination is finalized. So we don't yet know what the all of the expectations will be. The core expectations are set out in the Act, and these include reasonable steps to ensure the safety of users on the platforms. They also include reasonable steps to minimize materials such as cyberbullying of children, adult cyber abuse, non-consensual sharing of intimate images, et cetera, in line with our regulatory schemes. And also importantly, services would be required to provide clear and easily identifiable ways to report and make complaints about material online and make those discoverable for users, easy to find and easy to use. So where we will have powers is to require services to report on the extent to which they are complying with these expectations, particularly when it isn't clear. And this is important because it will finally let us see kind of behind the curtain or under the hood at what safety features, policies, and practices some of the big tech companies have in place. And we'll aim to develop an approach which acknowledges and highlights good safety and transparency reporting practices, but also identifies areas for improvement and provides recommendations and collaborative support. So once the expectations are released, we'll work with stakeholders to develop guidance and assist them to build their capability to meet the expectations. And we've made the choice to extend that period out 6 months so that we can give industry time to, again, comply with those. Just wanted to show you a little bit of the safety by design assessment tools. Again, this was developed cooperatively, but they're a great starting point for companies to audit and improve safety practices. We'll be consulting with stakeholders to develop further guidance on a range of reasonable steps to fulfill government's expectations. But the feeling is if companies are utilizing the tools, assessing their risks, and building protections in to address these risks, they should be well placed to succeed where the codes are concerned and where the BOWs is concerned as well. So that was a lot to take in. I want to thank you all for listening. In the short time we've existed, we are proud of what we've achieved in helping thousands of Australians have better, more safer experiences online and get seriously harmful content taken down, but also reaching millions more with our education, prevention materials and programs to help empower them to have those more proactive and safer experiences online. Thanks, and I look forward to any questions you might have.
Thanks very much, Julie. That was really informative, both in terms of the background and some of the detail around the current programs. So I'd encourage anyone to drop any questions into the chat, and I'll keep an eye on that. Just while I give people the opportunity to do that, I wondered if I might ask you about that, one of those final points that you were making, which was the relationship of the BOEs, specifically on the online content scheme, to the content of the code. So say the objectives that and the measures that will be built into the codes. Could you just say something more about the relationship of those expectations in the BOEs and the objectives, I guess, around? There's some crossover there, is there?
I mean, I think there is. You know, if you go back to that pyramid, and you look at the codes, what they're trying to achieve, and the BOE, you know, I look at the BOEs as you know, kind of that license to operate, and you know, we see a lot of safety protections by press release these days, and then we never see any information about or data around, you know, what was the uptake, did it actually work, did it not work. So the BOEs are really important in helping us to assess whether or not companies are fairly and consistently not only you know, enforcing their own policies, but whether or not their features, their safety protections are efficacious, but also whether or not they're really tackling wicked problems. So we can compel periodic transparency reports, or we can compel transparency reports around specific problems, like, you know, what are you doing to enforce your real names policy, and what kind of you know, information are you collecting? What are you doing to prevent recidivism, or, you know, bad actors continuing to show up on your platforms? What are you doing to address volumetric attacks or brigades or pylons? Those types of things. So the BOEs gives us a little more freedom to really look under the hood, I said, whereas the codes are a co-regulatory tool that are mandatory, and of course there's going to be a period where we're going to have to see whether or not, you know, I'm making the assumption that we will be registering a set of codes, and then we'll have to assess compliance and whether or not they're effective, and if they're not, then we can implement a standard. Now the government and the department, of course, in their design of the Act, I believe, did look at this holistically so that they're fitting together. We are aware that there are a lot of moving pieces here, and it can be confusing, which is why I wanted to spend some time kind of demystifying, talking about how they work together. You know, on top of that, we were asked separately by the government following the Age of Innocence inquiry to put together an age verification roadmap on preventing access to harmful pornography by children. So we've done a call for evidence there. We've just started our first round of stakeholder engagements and foundational research. So we expect that a lot of what we learn from that process will also inform the codes. So one of the things that we've done with the codes is we said, yes, this is complex. You can do this in sections. So if you want to focus on the most harmful and illegal content first, like child sexual abuse material and pro-terrorist content, let's focus on really nailing the class 1 content first. And then we can tackle class 2. We're hoping by that time we'll have you know, a lot more input and guidance in terms of where the roadmap for the age verification process is going, and really it's not a legislative or regulatory process. We're basically building like it is just that, a roadmap that government will consider, like a feasibility study. But deep and consultation is required by a range of stakeholders there. So again, lots of moving and interlocking parts.
Right. Okay. Thanks very much for that. And that leads nicely into our that consultation aspect of one of the reasons why we decided to invite some panelists. So thanks very much, Julie. We'll move on to the panel now. We'll have another opportunity for comments at the end of the panel. So the way this is going to work is we've got 5 panelists. They're each going to have 5 minutes to give a short outline of make some comments on the code development process, this kind of environment that we have at the moment, and then I'll give them a short opportunity to respond to anything that to each other and anything that arises and what they say, and then we'll go to we'll open the floor to questions from anyone else. So I guess we've got 5 speakers, and the idea was indeed to try to cover some different perspectives and to combine industry perspectives with some community perspectives. So our panelists comprise, first of all, 2 industry people. So we've got John Stanton, the CEO of Communications Alliance, and Jenny Duxbury, who's the Director of Policy, Regulatory Affairs and Research at Digi. And then we have 3 community representatives. First of all, Gerard Brody, who's the CEO of the Consumer Action Law Centre, but is today representing Consumers Federation of Australia. Andrew Williams, who's the acting CEO of ACAN, Australian Communications Consumer Action Network, and Lizzie O'Shea from Digital Rights Watch. Their full biographies are on our IIC site, so please do visit that if you'd like to hear some more. I won't provide too much more detail now. We'll go first of all to John and then Jenny to get a sense of industry perspective of associations that are likely to be involved in developing these codes, and then we'll go to the 3 consumer reps. So John, could I start with you, please? And so Communications Alliance has many years experience in developing codes of practice, including consumer codes. So perhaps you could kick us off just by telling us something about your approach to this particular code development exercise, and perhaps anything that you see is different from this round as compared to previous code development that you've been involved in.
Thanks very much, Derek, and to the IIC for inviting us to be part of today's event. And I'd like to echo the important acknowledgements of country that yourself and Julie have put out there. That's a very good thing. Firstly, speaking for Comms Alliance, I mean, we're in strong agreement with the objectives of the legislation. So there is no issue there, and we are determined to do the very best job we can with colleague organisations to develop the 8 codes that are contemplated under the Act. We've formed a steering group with Digi, with AMPTA, with the Software Alliance, the organisation responsible for gaming, the Computer Electronic Suppliers Association Alliance, and others to try to undertake the work. We've given ourselves a timeline which would see us submit the relevant draft codes for consideration by a commissioner for registration by the 22nd of June, hopefully leading to registration by the deadline, which is the 22nd of July next year. All that being said, and yes, you're right, we do have a fairly rich history of development of co-regulatory instruments. We've got about 130 of those that we look after under Comms Alliance, be they guidelines or codes or standards. This situation is one where the topography of the challenge is incredibly complex, and much of the terrain, I would say, is uncharted. And that's not surprising, given this is a new and large piece of legislation to which we're looking to underlay a co-regulatory framework. Comms Alliance itself will be leading the development of 4 of the codes of the relevant electronic services, hosting services, internet carriage services, and the manufacture and supply and maintenance and installation of relevant equipment. Jenny, I'm sure, will speak to the codes in which Digi is leading the effort. Some of the challenges, apart from the fact that you've got multiple codes and multiple drafting organisations, go to the overall scope of the task, and the fact that for the scope of these codes, it covers, in fact, every accessible website in Australia. It covers the breadth of chat and messaging services, including those where there's relatively little risk of harm. The sorts of chat services that are used in customer service and technical assistance in classrooms across Australia. It covers services like SMS and MMS, where it's not possible for the ISPs providing that platform to remove individual pieces of content. So there are practical challenges around what you can actually do, short of blocking a customer or a service altogether, to moderate or prevent these sorts of harms. We acknowledge that the eSafety Commission is looking for an outcomes-based approach to these codes, which is good. We support that. We know from deep experience, though, that it's very much easier for a regulator, any regulator, to espouse the virtues of an outcomes-based approach than it is for them to actually follow it when they are overseeing or consulting on the development of codes, because the natural tendency is to rush in the direction of prescription, and we understand that. So there's an interesting practical and philosophical sort of engagement that needs to happen to try to retain the sort of flexibility that an outcomes-based approach ought to have as an inherent part of its way of tackling a problem. There are some issues, we think, around the way that the BOs will interact with the codes and the rest of the framework. We don't think that the BOs is a correct name for the document, because its expectations are far more than basic. When you look through the detail of the various expectations that are within the BOs, there are many of them that go way beyond basic existing practice and indeed any international practice we know of. There's also a challenge, I think, as Julie alluded to getting all of the relevant players involved in the process. Those players offshore, those who provide services here but aren't here, players like the international sex industry. These are cohorts in which we don't necessarily have all the contacts we need or the existing relationships, and getting a comprehensive approach to that is just logistically hard, and we're working with the eSafety Commission on those challenges. There are some definitional challenges as well, where there's requirements around making sure that something is not harmful, or that a service can be used in a safe manner when those terms aren't defined. So there's work required there. There's also a lack of a safe harbour approach for providers, which we think is probably an important element to have when you're doing new things, and when there's the potential to potentially release commercially confidential or private information, or the potential to block a legitimate service. There's also challenges around the time frame for implementation. And I say all this not to try and paint a negative picture, and because we are determined to get there. We've already, got the first of the codes in draft form, but I don't think we should underestimate the scope or complexity of the challenge that not just ourselves, but all of the stakeholders, be they the consumers who we are looking to consult and add value to these codes, the government and regulatory stakeholders, and the other organisations who will be involved in developing the codes. It's going to require a really well-intentioned and pretty intense effort by all involved. And here we are at the end of the year, which doesn't help very much after the year that everybody has had. But we're optimistic. I'll pause there. I think I'm probably already over time.
Great, that's very helpful though. Thanks very much, John. That's a good selection of issues, and leads us right into Jenny. So Jenny, John mentioned the four codes or areas that the Comms Alliance is going to be dealing with. Maybe you could give us some idea of Digi's approach and the kinds of organisations that Digi's working with. I know Digi has some, and you personally have some very recent experience in developing the disinformation and misinformation code, which has some similar aspects in terms of its design. So maybe you could kick us off with the other side of the industry view.
Thanks very much, Derek, and thanks to the IIC for hosting this event. And I'd also like to add my acknowledgement to the traditional owners of the land upon which we are meeting. So Digi is one of the group of industry associations that are steering this project, which John mentioned. There is this very large group of associations that together, I think, represent a large number of the companies that will be regulated by these codes. The bulk of the heavy lifting on the actual drafting of these codes will be done by Comms Alliance, and Digi is picking up the piece that relates to social media services, search engines, and app distribution services. I wanted to say that for us, the development of these codes is a very welcome opportunity to collaborate with government and the community to improve the safety of Australian users online. And we very much share the goal of the eSafety Commissioner for these codes and also for the broader outcomes of the new online safety scheme. So probably just worth saying that we are still in the early stages of the code development process. Comms Alliance might be a little bit further advanced than us, but how we've kind of broken up this project because of its scale and the timing constraints is into kind of like chunks of work. And the first chunk is to actually develop draft codes. So what we're doing at this period of time, or have been doing since the launch of the very helpful position paper by the eSafety Office, is to actually start developing measures. And those measures are aimed at achieving the particular outcomes that are outlined on the position paper. As John said, one of the things that's slightly different to a straight outcomes-based approach for these codes is that we need to have minimum measures developed for companies with higher risk profiles. So part of this process involves working through what is the appropriate factors for assessing risk for different industry sectors, and then working out what are the minimum measures. So it's a little bit different to the mis and disinformation code that Digi worked on, which was a pure outcomes-based approach where the participants in that code process were given complete flexibility to determine what measures were appropriate to actually meet the particular outcomes. What we're wanting to do here is come up with a set of minimum compliance measures that are sufficiently clear that the regulator will be able to enforce them, but also are sufficiently flexible that the very diverse range of businesses of different sizes and different risk profiles will be able to adapt their approach to meet those specific outcomes. I suppose I'd just like briefly just to make one more point before we move on, and that is in addition to trying to come up with a balanced approach that both achieves these outcomes but gives sufficient clarity around enforcement, we are also going to be working hard to produce a document that is going to be able to be clearly understood both by businesses and the community. We think that's really important. So it's been noted that the first one of these codes is going to deal with Class 1 material, which is very serious, egregious material that I think everyone in business and the community would agree need to be removed from the online environment. But this kind of terminology, what is Class 1 material, isn't necessarily completely well understood, I think, across the entire community and the entire range of businesses that are going to be regulated. So one of the things that we're going to have to do, I think, is to work very closely with the community and with relevant stakeholders and the Commissioner as part of the consultation process to make sure that what we've come up is sufficiently clear. So, you know, Class 1 material includes things, as the Commissioner has said, like child sexual exploitation materials and pro-terror materials, and materials that instruct in crime or violence. And one of the really useful things that that position paper does is actually put a lens on these sorts of things that shows the different kinds of harms that we should be trying to be combating. So hopefully we're going to be able to use that framework and that kind of information to craft something that will be, you know, easy for people to read, understand, and implement. But we're very happy to discuss, you know, the consultation process further in the session.
Great, thanks very much, Jenny. So we'll go straight to our 3 community reps now. And so Jared Brody is going to lead us with a discussion of some principles that Consumers Federation of Australia has developed around that aspect that that both John and Jenny referred to about the consultation that's involved in the code development. So Jared, over to you.
Well, thanks, Derek, and thanks for the invitation to chat to you today. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we're meeting. For me, I'm in Melbourne, so that's the Wurundjeri and Bunurong people of the Kulin Nations, and I pay respect to their elders past and present and recognise their ongoing custodianship of land, water and country. For those that don't know about the Consumers Federation of Australia, we're the peak body for consumer organisations nationally and represent a diverse range of consumer organisations, including most major national organisations. We are an unfunded peak body, so our key priorities is to provide a sort of venue of communication amongst consumer advocates and share information across the consumer movement. And we also play a role in nominating and appointing consumer representatives to various boards, committees and forums and the like, and supporting consumer reps in their work. CFA is often asked to coordinate or lead submissions into the development and or the review of industry codes. And so we've sort of observed that there could be real inconsistent approaches taken in developing codes. So in 2018, we decided to establish our own good practice principles for consumer advocate involvement and expectations of development and reviews of industry codes. Bit of a mouthful there. So I just thought I'd cover briefly some of the principles in the document to give you a bit of an insight. We recognise that there are a range of guidances put out by regulators, but we also felt they didn't necessarily represent a statement of good practice from the point of view of consumer advocates. The first principle in our guide is independence of the process. So industry codes are generally, as we've heard, are owned or administered by an industry association. But we consider that industry associations should appoint an independent person or reviewer to develop or review a code of conduct. And that person should be capable of conducting the work with fairness, equity, and impartiality, independent of the interests of the body that nominated the person. And they should be adequately resourced through support people or a secretariat. I think we also say in our guidance that the independent person needs to have the capability, including relevant expertise, to conduct the review. And we say that generally we consider non-specialist consulting firms are rarely an acceptable choice. It's also good practice for the nominating body to consult with consumer reps about the selection of an independent person or reviewer. The second principle is around evaluating impact. This is more relevant for the review of existing codes, where we want to see an independent assessment of the impact and effectiveness of existing code provisions. The assessment should consider the extent to which the code has achieved its stated objectives. The third principle focuses on consultation, a really important part. The consultation process, the guidance says, should be meaningful, genuine, and efficient. The process should be capable of identifying and examining the issues of concern to consumers of the relevant industry. And generally that would require an open process at the outset to identify all the relevant issues before narrowing on approaches to address those issues. It might include, a broad call from submissions, targeted consultation with particular groups with particular experience, public forums, publication of an independent report or a draft, and opportunities to review and comment on drafts of code wording. We consider that consumer representatives can become directly involved in the development of codes or codes of practice, including by sitting on development or drafting committees or as an observer. It can be an effective way to provide input. How we state that consumer reps should retain independence and their participation should not be taken as support for final positions of codes unless there's specific, support provided. The fourth is around resourcing consumer engagement. We consider that it's good practice for the relevant industry body to resource the consumer sector to participate in the review, unless there's an existing source of resourcing for that participation. That just recognises the reality that there's limited resourcing available in the consumer advocacy sector. Resourcing also allows coordinating consumer bodies to effectively consult with consumer representative colleagues and to process and organise their input into a clear and cogent submission. Consumer organisations have frequently chosen to work through CFA to coordinate these sort of submissions, and sometimes CFA appoints a member to undertake that necessary work. The final principle I'll mention relates to timeframes for the process. We suggest that a clear and realistic timeframe for a process should be identified up front and clearly communicated to stakeholders. A process shouldn't be rushed. It should be sufficient to ensure the relevant body is really listening to stakeholders. However, likewise, a process should not drag on, and a completion date is helpful to focus all stakeholders. I recognise in this instance, the completion date's been imposed by government, not necessarily by the body themselves, so a slightly different context. And we'd also say that time frames for submissions should acknowledge the need for consumer groups to consult with their colleagues and members. We suggest that 6 weeks is a generally appropriate minimum period to respond to a call of submissions, and longer around holiday periods and the like. Look, these principles were developed after consulting more broadly amongst our membership, so I feel that they provide a good view about what we think is a good process in the development of industry codes, and so I recommend to you all today and the industry bodies in particular. Thanks, Derek.
Thanks very much, Jared. That's very helpful context for the development of the codes. And in this instance, I guess, we know that one of the consumer or community organisations that will be participating in this co-development process is ACAN. So whether or not CFA in its own right is doing that, ACAN is an organisation that has had a lot of experience participating in, particularly in the codes that John's organisation, Communications Alliance, has been involved as the association administering those codes. So we have with us now Andrew Williams, who's the acting CEO of ACAN. So Andrew, over to you for any observations.
Yeah, thanks very much, Derek. And I'd also like to echo my thanks to the IIC for enabling us to participate in today's forum. The conversation's been really good so far, and it's really good to be involved. I'm coming today from the land of the Guringai people of the Eora Nation, some of the northern suburbs of Sydney, and I too would like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I guess my comments really relate to, and it's really good to follow on from Jared, because my comments relate primarily to, I think, the principles 3 and 6, and they are quite interrelated with the time frame for the process and meaningful consultation. When the eSafety discussion paper came out, one of the first things that really stood out to ACAN was the tight time frame and the opportunity to participate and provide some consumer input or really community input into the code development process. So, and we had some preliminary conversations with Comms Alliance and Digi on that front. And then what we did, we went and convened what we'd broadly call a community working group of not only ACAN members, but also other like-minded individuals and organisations who have a vested interest in making sure that the code development process provides a really good outcome. So this group really designed to reflect the diverse perspectives of all the communities that we engaged with. So the result of that first gathering was that we, on behalf of that community group, ACAN reached out to both Comms Alliance and Digi to express the views and the thoughts of that group, and see if we could continue the conversation to get the consumer representation or the community representation into the code development process as early as possible. And I've got to say, it's actually been really encouraging. The dialogue and the communication that's gone on between our organisations has been very productive and very positive. And I actually do thank John and Sunita and Jennifer for their willingness to hear the point of view. And as recently as last Friday, we had a follow up from both organisations. So we're really confident we'll be able to keep the dialogue going and get some have a more in-depth conversation about the code development and the community insight. So we anticipate we'll be able to have that in the next couple of weeks. So I just wanted to get out there and thank both of them. And also we're about to release some research. We did some high-level research a couple of weeks ago that we'll be releasing in the next few weeks about some of the digital platforms issues. So that the timing's really good, and all of these issues are starting to converge quite well. So I guess in a nutshell, in the interest of time, I won't go on too much further, but it's really evident that everybody's working to the same objective. Everybody wants these codes to work, and ACAN and the community group that we're working on behalf of is certainly no exception to that. So we're looking forward to continuing the conversation, and do acknowledge the tight timeframes, but we're really confident that if we can work together with industry, then we will be able to get that community insight into the codes, and that way we'll be able to meet those deadlines. So I'll probably leave it at there, Derek, because I think I'm just going to repeat what others have said.
Great. Thanks very much, Andrew. So that's from Andrew and Jared. That's a great setting for the process around the code development. We might come back and discuss that with Jenny and John in a moment. But first, Lizzie, can we come to you finally? Because Digital Rights Watch has had quite a bit to say in the past on aspects around regulating online speech and so on. And so slightly different perspective from you on some of the issues that arise and the formation of these codes.
Thanks so much, Derek. I too want to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land in which we're all meeting together from all over the country, and pay my respects to elders past and present. Thanks again for the opportunity to speak today, and I'm really grateful actually to the contributions of my other panel members and Julie as the keynote. I think it's been really useful discussion for me personally as well, and hopefully others in the audience. So Digital Rights Watch is a small charity organisation founded in 2016 whose mission is to ensure that people in Australia are equipped, empowered and enabled to uphold their digital rights. So there's quite a lot we could say about this whole legislative environment and this process. And my aim here is really to kind of offer complementary comments really to the contribution of others today. And to that end, I'm going to focus a bit more on content rather than say process. But I did want to say that, of course, we think think consultation is a really important component of developing these codes, and we would be advocating as a general principle that industry should be taking a human rights-based approach. But I wanted to talk about, I suppose, three things really in respect to the content of these kinds of codes: the use of automation in terms of content moderation, the potential perils of blanket categorization of content by type, and also the role of encryption and how it might be treated by these codes. So firstly, we're quite concerned that industry might have been incentivized to use automated processes to proactively monitor and remove harmful content. And this has been proven in other contexts to result in the removal of lawful and legitimate online content. And we're concerned that there's a substantial risk that relying on automated processes to proactively minimize harmful content might result in the removal of content which is entirely permissible and lawful due to error. And we don't want systems that offload the responsibility for addressing that problem onto individuals. And we think that if automated processes are going to be used to meet the expectations set for industry in this space, we think that there should be a focus on using open source tools, on industry committing to transparency around standards, and developing appropriate appeals mechanisms that are fast, that are cheap for users to use, and that are effective. And we think there's a role as well for the eSafety Commissioner to play in terms of outlining rules and guidance for testing prior to rollout of these kinds of automated tools, and including expert consultation and trials. We think all trials of these kinds of automated processes should be overseen by humans and have appropriate feedback loops in place to make sure they're doing what they intend or what is intended by industry in implementing them, and regularly also audited post-implementation as well. Now, in terms of blanket categorization of content by type, we are concerned around that also being incentivized in some of the frameworks in place by industry in the development of these codes. And we think it's really important that context be given to some of this content in order to ensure that its full meaning is understood. So what I mean by that, I'll give you an example. We think proactively asking services to remove material that depicts abhorrent violent material does, of course, objectively sound good, but it may result in proactive removal of content that documents human rights abuses or instances of state violence, for example, such as the disproportionate use of force by police. And that content is undeniably upsetting, but it is also essential, we would argue, in the pursuit of justice and for accountability of power. And it is one of the great sources of power that users have in using the internet as a force for good, as a force for holding power accountable for misuse and abuse of that power. And I suppose the difference is really between material that promotes, incites, or instructs abhorrent violent conduct and material that depicts it. And we want to make sure that industry codes, as they're developed, understand that nuance and distinction, and don't proactively remove content that has important political value, and to provide alternative reasonable steps to minimise content that might fulfill that criteria of being of important political value, including things like sensitivity warnings and the like. Again, I think the eSafety Commissioner has a role to play in terms of providing guidance on determining political importance to reduce the onus of ambiguity that might otherwise fall to industry. The last kind of issue I wanted to comment about in this space is encryption. We are a bit concerned about how industry might treat encryption in the context in which these codes are being developed. We note that the basic online safety expectations frames encryption as potentially an inhibitor to safety. And we would argue that, in fact, the opposite, the consensus of the cybersecurity industry is that encryption is really vital to facilitate safety. And I do, again, think industry codes really need to come to terms with that nuance. Of course, encryption facilitates the security of all many of our online activities on a daily basis, preventing data from being accessed by cyber criminals, ensuring safe online transactions and the like. But it's also really important to children. Encryption protects, for example, feeds of users' webcams and baby monitors, things that we want to make sure are protected from criminal activity. And I think encryption has a really strong and important role to play, and making sure it's available for users to be able to use for those kinds of purposes is really important. It's particularly important, I think, for vulnerable groups, including LGBTIQ people who might need to communicate in conditions of secrecy, survivors of domestic violence and the like, who rely on encryption to avoid information being disclosed about them, about their location, for example, to protect digital evidence and the like. So it's got a real role to play in improving safety. And I think it's really important that industry codes come to terms with that. So those are the three kind of content issues I wanted to raise. We've obviously got a lot more we could say about it, but hopefully that gives you an idea of the ways in which we would like industry codes to take a human rights-based approach, so that vulnerable communities and individuals aren't left to pick up the pieces of systems that are designed for a majority that might seem good in principle, but do have important problems that might arise that need to be addressed quickly and effectively.
Great, thanks very much, Lizzie. Before we open to any questions, and I encourage people to drop anything into the chat, I said I'd give the panelists an opportunity, first of all, if there's anything that any of you have said that that someone else wants to respond to. So is there anyone? I've certainly got a couple of things that I noted as I went along from someone else's that I put back to someone else on the panel. But first of all, is there anything any of you would like to say to one another as a result of what you've heard?
I've got my hand up, Derek, sorry. Listen, I just wanted to respond to all three of Lizzie's points, and I think she might be surprised that I actually agree with pretty much everything she said. And I think that's the challenge here, because there's so many shades of gray, and I'm not an absolutist by any stretch of the imagination. So on the first point, I agree that if you leave content moderation, we know that AI is flawed. We know that the in natural language processing, all of these things, that the machines are only as good as they are trained. And that's what one of the reasons I believe that sort of regulating for algorithms would be next to impossible. Because not only do you need to look at the machines, you have to look at all that training data, and there would be lots of private information that would be contained there. I don't know of at least a responsible organization that uses AI to surface mostly known, say, child abuse images, or with photo DNA and some of the other technologies. They've got a pretty high level of reliability, but I still don't know many that don't use human moderation as the final arbiter. And until we have much better numbers, I would tend to agree. On the second point around the AVM powers, I think there's still a lot of misinformation around what they cover. AVM does not capture the types of scenarios and content that Lizzie mentioned in terms of speaking truth to power or war crimes or police violence. It's very specifically about terrorism, kidnapping, murder, rape, abhorrent violent conduct that is captured by the offender and shared online for the purposes of inciting more hate and violence. So it can't be bystander content. My investigators did speak to Anne Ollie, the chair of the committee, quite extensively around this. So there are protections, and we've actually made some decisions that they talked about that may have been violent, but it was around a Syrian conflict, but we didn't think it met the definition of AVM powers for that very reason. That you sometimes do need to speak truth to power, and it wasn't for the purposes of inciting further terrorism and violence. And on the third issue, I invite you all to go to our section on end-to-end encryption. Obviously we need encryption to ensure the sanctity and privacy and the security of the internet. I think the area and where we've kind of come out strongly against it is when a few companies have said we're going to end-to-end encrypt this particular messaging service, when we know the vast preponderance of child sexual abuse material that's reported into NCMEC, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, is happening on that particular service. And what that means is they've just turned off the light, and well, we don't know what's happening on our platform anymore. So if there's, children being abused. So what we advocate is looking at creative ways like homomorphic encryption tools and other ways that can be privacy protecting, so that we're not effectively turning out the lights or absolving platforms of responsibility for that kind of, conduct and content being shared on their platforms. I don't think in terms of absolutes or binaries. I think that's going to be the key for the industry, I believe, going forward, is balancing this range of fundamental rights, looking at privacy, safety, and security as three legs of a stool that really need to be balanced and recalibrated from time to time. So, but Lizzie may want to respond to that.
For what it's worth, Julia, I'm not at all surprised to hear that. No, I'm grateful though that you responded. I mean, I don't. Part of the problem, I think, is that there's expectations that are set, and then industry is developing this code, and industry, for better or worse, has an interest in trying to minimize the amount of work that they have to do here. And I'm not saying that, I don't mean that in a critical way, but that
could be chilling. It could be chilling. Yeah.
It could be chilling. Exactly. And so I think some of these things, they will come to the fore as these are developed, and it's really important to have that ongoing conversation about it. But I agree with you. I mean, I don't think any right is absolute. I think it's absolutely a matter of balancing rights. That's, common human rights practice. And then the question becomes, if you're going to place a burden on someone's rights, is it necessary and proportionate? And that is the kind of process that I would hope industry goes through and, is incentivized by the frameworks that exist. And we would be advocating for that kind of thinking process in terms of tackling some of these issues. But I wouldn't also ever pretend that these are very straightforward or easy problems to solve. So I'm completely alive to that.
Yeah. I'd say that's a consistent theme.
Thanks, Lizzie and Julie. Jenny and John, I wondered if did either of you have anything that you wanted to comment on what's come out of that discussion between Lizzie and Julie?
I'm happy to comment. Look, I would just first of all say that we are very alive to these issues, and having just been through the process of developing the disinformation and misinformation code, we are really very conscious of the importance of preserving the value of free discourse in a democratic society where that is appropriate. And these are issues that we will need, we agree, we will need to factor these into the development of measures for these codes. I do think that the point that Lizzie's made, which is about the need for transparent guidance on this, is quite a good one, because we are talking about such a huge range of companies that will be impacted by this, and they need to be equipped with the tools that they will be able to make those fine and nuanced judgments that Lizzie is talking about. And I absolutely agree with you, Lizzie. Context is always key. So, you can say that class 1 content, for example, includes content that depicts, violence. But as you rightly point out, there are appropriate circumstances when people need to be able to see that violence, because it might be depicting, egregious human rights violations, or police brutality, or things of that nature that citizens rightfully will be concerned about and need to see. So I'm really glad that you raised these issues to our attention, and we think that these are the sorts of issues that will really benefit from a robust consultation process.
Derek, if I could just add to that, I agree with the points that have been raised. I think we all need to have in the back of our mind the breadth of responsibility, expectation, and action that is implied or could flow from this, and what that means to the cost of services, the disruption of systems and processes, and so forth. And there has to be a need to focus on the things that really matter and which you can address, and to recognise that, for example, within the BOS, there's an expectation that we would be able to share volumetric data across platforms and do so relatively easily. No, and that is an area that can prove problematic in terms of protecting, the privacy and rights of consumers. There is an expectation that, and the expertise to do that is not necessarily universally shared among participants. There's a hope that individual providers will invest in and develop their own filtering tools. Why? When there are off-the-shelf solutions. And I'm not saying that we're necessarily opposed to those sorts of things, but at some point you've got to run a ruler over what you're asking of industry, what it means to the costs of services to consumers, and whether you're actually sort of building in risks that don't need to be there. The process of being targeted in this exercise is every bit as important as the process of trying to be comprehensive in the safety that gets provided to consumers. Both of those things need to be dealt with great seriousness and endeavour.
Okay, thanks, John and Jenny. Maybe I'll just address one last question to Jared and Andrew. So one of the principles, Jared, that you mentioned was some process for identifying issues at the outset that are relevant to consumers. I wonder, do you think that, to both of you, is this process a bit different in that we have the resource of the eSafety Commissioner's Office with, say, the information even that Julie gave us today on the stats for how the escalation in complaints over the last period. Is this environment a bit different, or is it still one in which there's some level of unknown on the consumer or community side about what those issues are, and is there a need for some kind of mapping of those, or do you think actually there's that through the policy process so far we have a fairly good understanding of what they are?
Do you want me to take that one first, Jared? Yeah, I think, I guess the answer is probably a little bit of everything there, Derek. But again, that's why we've reached out to Comms Alliance and Digi just to get involved as early as possible, bring the community groups involved in the conversation. Because when the discussion paper was released, it just appeared that the first opportunity would be after the codes had been drafted and then gone for that 30-day or 30-day or thereabouts community consultation period, which would be probably towards the end of the process, around the middle of next year. So that's why we've reached out, brought the groups, our working group together, and as I said in my little piece earlier, that if we can have a follow-up conversation, probably in early December, then I would expect that we've got as much input as we can provide in the from the community perspective as early as possible, noting that that Digi and Comms Alliance really have to have the time to get away and draft these codes. So we're confident that we'll be able to get the community voice heard, and then when it comes to the consultation piece towards the back end of the process, then hopefully there'll be some time for refinement if necessary there.
I guess I would just add, Derek, that the context of each industry code development will be different, and so having the work that's already been done to date, I think, is obviously important. I guess the points that our guidelines that we've published go to is that bringing the consumer or community voice in as early as possible is going to be beneficial. That you can ensure that how issues are scoped, and maybe they're already identified, but how they're scoped and described will benefit from having input from the broader community as early as possible, to then sort of articulate going to the next level of what the prescribed terms and things in the code might be.
Okay, thanks very much to both of you. So is there anything final that anyone on the panel would like to, or Julie would like to raise to finish us off?
No, I'd just like to thank you for convening this panel and to bring all these diverse stakeholders together. It's great to have us here. Again, I hear what the community organizations are saying as well, and these codes are unique in a range of different ways, but primarily in that they are directly focused on industry implementing the codes, and so we're very aware that there is an extensive stakeholder process for them that we want to help in any way that we can. Again, a lot of our stakeholders are their stakeholders, but there are some new players in this space. As I think it was John noted, the international adult conglomerates, for instance, might be new, but we're engaging with these groups through the age verification process, and we'll share those contacts so that they can have those as we have them or can find them.
All right, thanks very much, Julie. So that brings us to the end, and I would like to offer my sincere thanks to all of you for that discussion. It's very insightful. It's provided, I think, very good background for a process that you'll all be involved in, and hopefully a number of our participants on the webinar will be. So thanks again very much to Julie Inman Grant, to John Stanton, Jenny Duxbury, Jared Brody, Andrew Williams, and Lizzie O'Shea. Thanks also to Joe Ryan from the IIC for helping out behind the scenes and setting this up, and also to Julie's colleagues in her office who've helped us with it as well. In closing, I'd just like to mention one thing that's coming up for us. The IIC has one more event before the end of the year. That will be Chris Chapman, our international president, who will be in conversation with the Minister for Communications, Urban Infrastructure, Cities and the Arts, Paul Fletcher, speaking about some issues arising from his book that he published a little while ago, Governing in the Internet Age. So that will be on the 13th of December at the same time, 2 p.m. So 2 p.m. to 3 p.m, and we'll send out something about that. Thanks again to all of our keynote speaker and all of our panelists for your contributions today, and thanks to all of you for joining us. That's it.
Thank you.
Thanks.